Hello and welcome back to another installment of the Psychology of Humor. I will say that originally this video did not start out being the video it became. I started out here trying to examine the demographic differences and political differences in how we experience humor, but what I arrived at was the fact that I couldn't get past some very basic questions about this idea of political correctness that I was going to just mention briefly, that it turned into an entire video in and of itself. While all of these videos are intended to be standalone, I do highly suggest you check out the previous two installments on humor and persuasion, as well as women in comedy. But today's topic, such as it became, or mutated I suppose, is on the concept of political correctness in the realm of comedy, with a very simple question to begin our inductive process of reasoning. Can you be funny and also politically correct? This phrase itself has become somewhat ironically something of a meme at this point, but I've often said it as well, so it's important to answer that question with this. The left can't meme. We've all heard that, correct? Pretty much at this point. However, a common criticism or comment of this shorthand sort of statement that I have seen many people offer up to me is, well, Aiden, if the left can't meme, then why is it seemingly every single comedian or comedy writer is a massive bleeding heart lefty? And hey, that's a good question, because it does appear to be a bit of a conundrum, right? I mean, most, if not all of the comedians that I frequently use clips from are fairly left-leaning, or were, as many of them are dead, or at least moderately left-leaning. Guys like those involved in Firesign Theater, the people that I love the most, that I hold up as the pinnacle of comedy, they were all a bunch of hippie stoners, with half of their jokes, at least particularly those from their earlier albums, being downright Cheech and Chong tier.
Ever since the Sons took LSD, it's been a fundamentally better sun. More pink and green and electric blue.
Yet were, if your only exposure to them be from me, given I'm particularly fond of their mockery of communism, such as this.
Hiya, kiddo.
Shoes for industry, compadre.
Yeah, sure. Hey, you guys holding?
Oh, gosh, no. The means of production are held by all the people.
That's right.
Or their general just irreverence that you would never see today. You might think that this sounds like some fairly right-wing shit if you heard it outside of the context, if you couldn't tell the age of the records, if you couldn't tell just how old it is. You might actually think that this is a right-wing group of people making jokes. It's on par almost with Murdoch, is it not? Similarly, and certainly of more general appeal though to people outside of me who like old records from the 1970s, are people like the late greats, George Carlin, Richard Pryor, who despite seeming, as the kids say today, woke, are woke in a very different manner than they were at their time of recording these kinds of messages, right? Carlin's dirty words bit remains now as a monument and a testament to the importance and necessity of free speech that is under attack from the same political orientation that he himself unquestionably belonged to. So, why might it be that we find so many comedians, not just now, but across modern history, lean left? Particularly when it seems as if the left is incapable of much humor nowadays. Not all, but some. Could this lie in the question and the problem of being politically correct? Well, interestingly enough, I think a leftist himself may have inadvertently provided us with a bit of an answer. Let's check out this Big Think video featuring comedian Paul F. Tompkins, a stand-up I, unsurprisingly, have never heard of, on why political correctness is in fact not a detriment, but of value to comedy.
Topics that were routinely joked about years ago that might affect certain people. Maybe it's something that happened to someone and we throw a word around because it's a shocking punchline and it's good for a laugh. But is it worth it? And over time, people who are tired of being ashamed because a thing happened to them, they vote with their silence, or they say, that's not funny. And I think that comedians have to recognize that humor evolves and times change, and you can't stay stuck in the same place for too long because then you're irrelevant. And so it's very easy to say, oh, people are too uptight now. They're too uptight. But the fact of the matter is, these people are the people of today. And you might be a person of yesterday if you can't adjust and you can't be in tune with what people think is funny anymore.
Now, let's break down a little bit of what Paul has tried to express here before jumping too quickly to judge him as a person or as a comedian. Well, certainly plenty of the viewers of this video did, as reflected in the like to dislike ratio, now didn't they? But let's be fair. Paul asserts that what is funny is culturally and socially relevant, and that offensive jokes don't garner laughter because they will, well, offend. Offensive offends. But is that accurate? Is it true that if something is offensive, it cannot be funny? Or if something is offensive, that thereby it will alienate your audience? Here at the outset, I hate when I answer my questions too early. Somewhat. He is not completely wrong, but let me explain why he is wrong and in what contexts and situations in which this matters. Welcome to the purpose of today's video. Well, we have covered in previous videos on the psychology of humor the Wits 3 model of humor, which categorizes some of the most commonly used types of humor into factors of incongruity resolution, nonsense, and sexual humor. We still struggle to determine what is it exactly that makes a joke funny. There has to be some kind of magic formula, except there isn't. There is no magic formula that makes something humorous. So we have to get into the nitty-gritty and dig down into the dirt, get down in there and put your knees in it to try to understand the complexities of humor. And while we know from the Cunningham and Derks 2005 study that will again be important not so much in this video but in later ones, just keep it in mind, that overly verbose jokes that take more cognitive energy to be processed as humor are less funny, we still really haven't gotten into, in the course of the series, further into what exactly about jokes makes us laugh. We know the general categories, we know that jokes that are too long and too wordy aren't very funny, but we don't really know what makes something humorous. We know also that, particularly in adults, incongruity resolution. This is the problem-solving aspect of joking or humor, to solve the joke's puzzle, such as it is, in your brain by working through the absurdity of a statement, understanding why it is absurd, and then arriving at a conclusion, either internally or with the comedian's use of a punchline, is generally perceived of as the funniest general type of humor in the Wits 3 model, over nonsense and sexual. So thus far, we know the best way to appease the widest audience is to have your jokes be quick and dirty, not sexually dirty, or at least immediately recognizable as an attempt at humor, and to involve an aspect of comprehension and resolution from the audience. But what really is incongruity? I've mentioned it a lot, but what defines this oddity in humor? What is incongruity resolution? Well, it's expectancy violation. It's hearing something you didn't expect to hear, and then processing why that violation was amusing or unanticipated. Thus, what is humor? Well, it often is saying things that contradict or subvert cultural and societal norms. Thus, why have most of your and my favorite comedians, just a guess, and entertainers, why have they been left-leaning? Well, because in part there was, at their time, something they were violating that was culturally or socially normative, as Paul in this video from Big Think describes. The culture supported that as the norm, and thus to violate it was what made it funny. Paul's error here is in not understanding that the cultural gestalt has changed from predominantly conservative and potentially religious norms, and moved to one of political correctness, tone policing, and outright restriction of freedom of speech. Anything that is deemed offensive, problematic, racist, sexist, homophobic, or just too conservative.
You can't have this opinion, it's too conservative, we're not going to allow it. I think that's a bad move. I'm a First Amendment absolutist. I believe in only two things completely, the First Amendment and boobs. And so once they made
that is now being stifled. So when people like Paul say you have to change with the times, he himself is correct, but actually quite interestingly, correct in the wrong direction. What is funny now is not going to be what's politically correct. Why? Because being politically correct has become the social norm. I kind of want to say at the outset, because I'm about to go on a very long spiel about this, yes, You can be funny and politically correct, of course you can, but I'm talking about at large. There are some people who just have great charisma, great joke craftsmanship, who can be politically correct and funny. But in terms of the overall zeitgeist, no. You should be subverting cultural norms if you want to engage in humor. In short though, what is funny in 2018 on average? Is it following the norms and mores of society and speaking of topics with the exact same perspective and tone that are regurgitated every single day on CNN? Fuck no, not on average. That's not going to be the best way to get a laugh.
So I like Hillary because I performed at her. I know you're here to laugh, but you know what? You choose your life. You choose the way you want to live your life. It's just too important. It's just too important. So we're gonna spend 5 minutes. We got 1 more minute talking about it. So everybody point to the people booing. Just point to. Okay, so go. Told you. Right.
The hottest memes are originating from the right, at least in part, because the right is lambasted and castigated by the mainstream. It makes them, as I believe Paul Joseph Watson would call them, punk, in vogue. We do seek the novel. This is a Big Five personality trait, but moreover, it is more indicative of all of us. This is not a trait. This is an inherent human just state. Our eternal propensity for psychological reactance. The screw you, you're not my real dad element of the human mind.
Get that kid off my eyes, you little wankers. Alright, give him the stick. Don't give him the stick!
You know my dad?
Oh.
We don't want to hear things we've already heard before. We don't want to be told what to do. And as such, it makes the right now in comedic vogue. At least in part. Don't ask me to name too many right-leaning comedians, and we could get into why that is. I don't think Steven Crowder is particularly funny. But again, we're talking about the difference between comedians and memes. And that still has nothing to do with the fact that many left-leaning comedians have often espoused what we would now call right-leaning views, at least so far as they pertain to freedom of speech. It's just again that the times have changed. What is acceptable has changed. Very much like as Paul said. But Paul is the one who doesn't appear to be able to keep up with the times as he prescribes to other comedians, because being PC is again now the norm. As such, truly great comedians have always understood this. We can see that quite evidently, as they have understood the necessity for freedom of speech. I have to admit, I was generally unaware of Opie and Anthony until I was introduced to it somewhat recently, mostly by Sinatra. But Patrice O'Neal, I at least did know of. And some of his statements that I have heard in that podcast, well, they're illuminating to say the least. They're at least interesting. Such as his qualms regarding the question of the acceptance of sexual orientation.
Fuck the context, because anything I say or you say, they can flip it around and use it against you.
Well, they have, so
but
we know that.
I should be able to say anything I fucking want. Look, I should be able to say something about gays. Look, I said something on a podcast I did a long time ago, and I was playing the president, the president, and I go, why is being gay of preference and tying a bitch up and peeing on her a fetish?
Yeah.
Why is who I decide to fuck some type of profound fight? I just want to have that discussion. Because I'm here to say, look, it's not about love. Because I can go, man, I love you, man. I love you too, man. Brotherly. Right. I love you. I love a man. But it ain't gay until I'm fucking you. I love my dog. I love my dog. But it's not bestiality unless I'm fucking my dog.
Till you start fucking.
So if I fucking have a crush on you...
Now Patrice is a big black dude and probably unquestionably a leftist based on what he says. But that clip, such as I just played, could you imagine playing that today in 2018? Oh, he would have been strung up right along with Kanye for saying some shit like that. And even though just a few years ago when he did say it, it was controversial, that's true. It has taken on an entirely new meaning today. You could not say that today. that would make it far funnier, and I believe makes it far funnier, but hence that's why it's funny, because you can't say it. And such truly great comics seem to realize and recognize the value of their use of controversy in comedy, as well as the unquestionable import of free speech to facilitate a comedic environ. Tom Segura, arguably my favorite comedian working today, although not the fattest, that title belongs to Bernd Kreisler, was recently under attack from a group of people over his use of the word retarded in his Netflix special, which is, well, fucking retarded given the context of the joke. However, that mattered not to the people with an agenda who wanted to utilize Tom as a scapegoat to hang a movement upon. Well, the thing is, funnily enough, Tom had previously made a joke, one that is so close to one John Mulaney made a few years later that I don't think it's plagiarism, but I actually like to just kind of splice the two jokes together into one superior joke.
Also, I don't mean to gloss over what little people have been through in this country, but you cannot compare the plight of midgets to African Americans. That is outrageous. Midgets were never enslaved, unless you count the Wonka factory.
Anyway, my point is, Tom has frequently mocked the idea of word policing, as have many comics, and yet here we found he was the victim of word policing. See again George Carlin, and many other comics that have recognized the incredible importance of freedom of speech, and why being offensive is part of that. Because being offensive is on some level seemingly inherent to making something funny. Well, maybe not everything funny, but most things funny have to violate some kind of expectation. And that means that being offensive is one of the easiest routes to humor. So, Aiden, what really makes something funny then? You got all the answers? Hell no, I don't. I will tell you what I do know. As I said, it seems that Paul was on the right track, if ultimately completely and utterly incorrect in his assertion that political correctness in and of itself is funny, in that humor seems to be largely influenced by context, be it social, temporal, location, or reality. Anthropologist Mary Douglas noted that, quote, "The joke form rarely lies in the utterance alone, but can be identified in the total social situation." That's logical, right? You need social environs. Humor does not exist in a vacuum, and it is a process of human communication. Thus, of course, the social situation matters, and given what we do know about incongruity resolution, something about the joke should serve as a violation to the expectations applied to said situation. Hence, enter in benign violations theory, originally proposed by McGraw and Warren, 2010. The researchers noticed that it seems what makes us laugh is often what is violating our expectations. However, the violation need also be sufficiently benign and non-threatening to the self. For example, humans and apes alike engage in playful tickling. But consider what tickling is as an action. It is a physical attack upon another that results in a non-harmful, playful outcome. Thus, why outside of the physical stimulus itself, tickling is a form of eliciting enjoyment. From an evolutionary perspective, humorous violations likely originated as threats to physical well-being, e.g. the attacks that make up tickling or play fighting, but then, over the course of our evolution and our development, have expanded to include threats to the psychological well-being, such as insults and sarcasm, including as well behaviors that break social norms and mores, strange behaviors, farting, cultural norms, such as unusual accents, or being non-PC in the current sort of topic, linguistic norms like puns, logical norms such as absurdities or non sequiturs, and moral norms such as engaging in disrespectful behavior, bestiality, pedophilia, all this other shit that you can joke about, I suppose. It has to violate something, but it only can violate our normative expectations to a certain degree before it becomes creepy. For example, on the far end, if a random guy on the subway grabs you and starts tickling you, that's not funny, that's gross, that's a violation. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you tickle yourself, that's not funny because you don't get anything out of it from a social perspective. But back to the topic at hand. If being politically correct is the norm of our society, which it is, then violating that norm to a certain degree is kind of crucial in making something funny in the social context. In the first of the seminal research, McGraw and Warren found this to be the case. In the control condition, participants read a non-offensive statement, which they, as expected, did generally not find funny. But in the experimental condition, the participants saw an offensive version of the control statement with a single word being changed. For example, in the control, it's a story about a girl selling her jewelry on eBay to pay for her father's debts, changed in the experimental design to a girl selling her virginity on eBay to pay for her father's debts. That sort of story violates our typical social and moral mores of selling sex as being wrong, as being deviant. Yet at the same time, that second story, the experimental story, made more people laugh. And interestingly, participants noted that not only did it make them laugh, it made them laugh despite their perceptions that the behavior was morally wrong. In other words, we find humor in the incongruity with our expectations once again. Well, Aiden, I ask myself and pretend anyone else would ask such a question in anticipation that it is possible, I suppose, but doesn't this completely debunk your assessment of female comedians who present themselves as the antithesis of femininity? Aren't they violating expectations, and that's what makes them truly funny? No, it does not, Aiden. Or, I mean, viewer, fuck. Let's look at why. As I stated, this violation has to be based on current social norms. Let's take a look at Joan Rivers. Maybe not her face, because it's, oof, wow. But for example, Joan Rivers, a comedian who many people mentioned in the comments on my video on women in comedy, was a model of what is a funny woman. Well, what was Rivers' shtick? She was kind of a nasty, mean bitch, right? And when was Rivers at the prime of her popularity? Oh, was it between the late 60s and early 90s? Back when being a nasty woman might have actually had some kind of socially normative violation, and not as it did in 2016, Hill Dog,
I'm a nasty woman. Not as nasty as a man who looks like he bathes in Cheeto dust. Not as nasty as racism, or fraud, sexual assault, white supremacy, white privilege, ignorance, or misogyny. Not as nasty as treating girls like Pokemon before their bodies have even evolved. Not as nasty as your own daughter being your favorite sex symbol, like wet dreams infused with your
such a nasty trust
fund.
Lena Dunham, Amy Schumer, and all of their ilk with the vagina aren't funny. Not only for every reason that I listed out in my long slog through the women in comedy topic, but also because in the current year, this behavior from women is more or less acceptable, and thus violates no expectations. We expect women to be thoughts, as sad as that is.
If she breathes, she's a thought!
And as such, we expect Amy Schumer. We expect Lena Dunham. Nothing about them is interesting or unique. And thus, in accordance with benign violation theory, it does not fall into the kind of Goldilocks zone of what makes something funny, given it is too benign, it is too normative. It is the equivalent of tickling oneself, which is, interestingly enough, the topic of most of this feministy kind of humor now, isn't it? In the long run, right now, it is just too socially acceptable to be an irredeemable thought for any of this to be perceived of as funny by the average person. Again, these are averages and aggregates. Your mileage may vary. But it's also a bit more complicated than just violating social norms. As Lawrence Mintz noted in both interviews and in his comments on the nature of humor as social commentary, see 1985, pure insults are often not perceived of as funny except by those who already agree with the attack upon others. In opposition to normative humor of Schumer and the like, humor that violates social norms too much and is perceived of as an attack will likely only appease a small number of people who already agree with the joke, much as Schumer's humor only appeases really those who are, well, fellow stinky sluts. Jokes need to be crafted to not appear as direct assaults, such as we learned in the first video on attractiveness of other disparaging humor. With other disparaging humor, that means attacks being the lowest in ratings of attractiveness across all people who used humor. Thus, we might find something culturally insensitive in a joke such as, how do you know that Asian Americans have moved into your neighborhood? Well, the Mexicans took out auto insurance, as per Mintz as cited in McHale et al. 1997, as an exemplar. But Although it disturbs our expectations, it is also funny because it forces the listener to work through the incongruity of the joke, to use their cognitive heuristics of stereotypes to resolve the incongruity of, well, why did the Mexicans take out auto insurance, and to simultaneously recognize the joke as both a joke with its short length and a violation, as well as a non-threatening one, thus falling into the categorization of funny. Guys, I am completely aware of how fucking autistic it is for me to be breaking down a goddamn Asians can't drive joke like this. But we get back into it's the whole damn humor can be dissected as a frog can, but the thing dies in the process paradigm. Or I suppose the blind men described in an elephant parable if you prefer. But I'm going full steam anyway, so woo-woo!
I drink till I vomit, then punch like a comet. I'm
Hidden.
a drunken
YouTube scientist.
The point is, while boring milquetoast shite that fails to trespass upon our anticipations is not funny, nor is aggressively offensive humor that is not easily or immediately perceived of as a joke. If people can't tell what you're saying is intended to be funny, if it is that aggressive, it will not be perceived of as funny long term.
You can talk, you can talk, you can talk your brain now, motherfucker! Rolls out, he's a nigger! He's a nigger! He's a nigger!
Oh my god.
A nigger! Look, there's a nigger!
Thus, not only should you keep it short and simple, but offensive, but only offensive to the right degree. Hence, the difficult nature of merrymaking. Too offensive, not funny. Not offensive enough, not funny. Wow. We're kind of fucked here, aren't we? It actually even gets more complicated than that, though. Not only is the offensiveness of humor important, that offensiveness appears to be dependent on the proximity of which the joke approaches any one individual in various different formats, further illustrating the importance of the social aspect of comedy. What that means is, we like to laugh at others or at events that are removed from us from a certain degree, rather than at ourselves, or at events that are too temporally localized, things that we remember too closely. Comedians have frequently commented on this particular nature of humor, with the great Mel Brooks, whose films, by his own words, would be verboten today, who quipped that tragedy is when I cut my finger, comedy is when you walk into an open sewer and die. Thus, to test the validity of this proximity or involvement nature of humor, the fourth study of their initial assessment of benign violation theory, McGraw and Warren 2010 provided participants with a news story regarding a church raffling off a Hummer SUV, with the hypothesis being that religious people would find this to be a potentially offensive conflation of the secular world with that of the sacred. And the results supported this said hypothesis. Religious participants were less likely to be both disgusted and amused simultaneously by the news story, and were unique in that some of them only found the story to be disgusting, while in contrast, none of the non-religious participants found the story to be purely disgusting. If you don't understand what I mean, it is that the religious people found the story just disgusting, but people who were non-religious never had that kind of response. It is important to note that in the control condition as well, which involved a supposedly neutral story about a credit union, the same religious people similarly reported feeling uniquely disgusted, which was not found in the non-religious group. This perhaps indicates that some people of certain demographics don't have a particularly strong sense of humor. They aren't particularly humor-oriented, or are, perpetually offended, which will be the topic of our next installment, so keep that in mind. So we know that people who are highly involved in a joke, people who are involved in this case in the religion, may perceive that joke as more offensive and less funny, and be more disgusted by it. That's kind of unsurprising, the no-duh factor of social science. Remember a while back, though, when I mentioned that Tom Segura had previously joked about the offensiveness of things he had said? Well, that in particular was in regards to offending a midget after making a midget joke, thus making the midget the target of the joke, and the midget, being highly involved in its subject matter, may offend him uniquely, hence why he offered up his criticisms to Tom Segura.
Now he's very upset at this point, and he starts to lecture me, He goes, you shouldn't say midget. You shouldn't say midget. You should say little people. You shouldn't say midget. And I'm like, why not? And he goes, saying midget is like saying nigger. And I was like, whoa. First of all, we're both white. And if somebody hears you, I'm not protecting you.
And similarly, much as did later Tommy Bunn's retard joke, spurred on those with an agenda to push. In short, midget pun intended, not only are there certain personological differences that may make people more disgusted and less amused by jokes in general, those with high involvement are more likely to not enjoy a joke that regards that in which they are highly involved. We don't like to laugh at ourselves too much. A little bit, but not too much. Thus, why it may seem like a lot of feminists and leftists have no sense of humor, while to them, I'm sure it seems that the alt-right has no sense of humor when that humor is directed at the alt-right, and that to which they are deeply dedicated, making fun of white people. Although still I would go back to that succinctness thing, and I would say that jokes like this, they're just not funny. I think they're objectively not funny. This is a bad meme, and you should feel bad. But anyway, further it seems that comedy is somewhat based on physical distance. We have seen this sort of psychological or social distance, but physicality appears to matter as well. In the 5th study of their seminal work, McGraw and Warren found that after participants plotted a graph indicating the distances between points and then were exposed to a joke about a man fucking a chicken and then cooking and eating it, hang on a second, this is a plastic sheep fucker channel. I take offense at the use of poultry when a ewe is fine too.
Two things go through my mind. Either one, you're a sheep, playing a very risky game. Or two, you're an Englishman pretending to be a sheep, which in many ways is a much riskier game, would you not agree?
Anyway, people who plotted the longer graph, indicating more physical distance, found the chicken fucking gag funnier than those who plotted a shorter graph. While there's still more work to be done here, and we'll get more into it, we can now see how maybe there's another element of what violations we generally enjoy. We enjoy things that are a bit physically removed from us, particularly if they're offensive. In other words, when Kathleen Madigan makes a joke about the war in Afghanistan, and given the physical distance of that country from us in proximity, that can be funny. It doesn't affect us. We can laugh at her misfortune. We can laugh at her going there. It doesn't have anything to do with me. It's on the other side of the planet.
It's free, because my brother goes, how bad was it? I go, here's how bad it was, Pat. Here's what I want you to do. Go out into your garage, take off all your clothes, get into your walk-in freezer, and then every 15 minutes, I'm gonna come out there and throw sand in your face.
Thus, not only are our personal differences and involvement in a topic capable of impacting our perceptions of humor, so is our physical locale. Finally, it seems that humor has even more variables to define its sweet spot than just those. Time appears to be also of significant substance to what makes something funny. Mark Twain is noted as having said, "Comedy is tragedy plus time." And thus, both in the seminal research and in the follow-up analysis, this effect of time has always been of interest in the study of benign violation theory.
What's comedy? So I said, and then this is part of what I'm trying to say about getting back from it. I said, comedy is tragedy plus time. Tragedy plus time. See, when the night Lincoln was shot, you couldn't joke about it. You couldn't make a joke about that. You just couldn't do it. Now, time has gone by, and now it's fair game.
McGraw, Warren, Williams, and Leonard, 2012, sought to further examine various impacts of humor, including the social, physical, realistic, and temporal distance from the tragedies that are described by Twain in the quote above as being important to the concept of humor. In the first study, participants were asked to think of a tragic event that happened in their own lives, and to rate how funny they thought it was, as well as to rate the severity of the tragedy, and how long ago it occurred. The results forwarded that more tragic events were funnier than less tragic events after a prolonged period of time. That is, that people rated bad things happening to them as funnier over time, whereas things that were benign, non-tragic, they ceased basically to be funny at all. A second study reaffirmed these findings, with a stubbed toe incurred yesterday being perceived of as funnier than a stubbed toe from 5 years ago. And in contrast, with a car crash yesterday being perceived of as generally quite unfunny, but a car crash 5 years ago as the most funny condition. In other words, the more severe the tragedy, the funnier it is. But time is an important aspect of this perception. In other words, distance. And it's not that surprising now, is it? I mean, 9/11 jokes are pretty hilarious today, but imagine making one the day after the towers fell. I mean, sure, maybe a couple people might laugh, but really you get into that too soon effect, something I'll continue to cover in just a few minutes. The following studies from the McGraw et al. 2012 piece included in this research covered other elements, though, of distance outside of time, the first being social, and involved an experiment wherein participants were exposed to a scenario where a person accidentally donated either $2,000 or $50 to a Haitian relief fund. And I mean, either's a fucking joke, right? Considering that Haiti is a tropical paradise and not at all a shithole, at least according to Conan O'Brien, right?
Because Haiti doesn't need help. It's got coconuts and coconut milk. Heavenly place, oh Conan O'Brien, our loving leader said. Oh Conan O'Brien, he said it was a heavenly place. Liberals know the truth about it. It's not a shithole.
Anyway, participants were asked to imagine the person contributing this money, either $2,000 or $50, as either a close friend or as a stranger. And by the way, friends, I despise this kind of methodology. You cannot ask people to imagine a scenario that does not exist and expect any kind of valid results. I mean, that's metaphysically absurd. Hence, maybe why the results weren't so strong in the effects here. But the effect that does appear is that the extreme $2,000 loss, the tragedy, was perceived of as funnier when it occurred to a stranger or a perceived of stranger, while the more benign loss of the $50 dues was perceived of as funnier when participants believed it originated from a friend. In other words, yeah, we can laugh at our friends and we can laugh at ourselves. You can be PC and funny potentially here, right? You can laugh at yourselves. But we do find that that which is more distant is more funny, but only in certain instances. It does not mean that we cannot laugh in that which we are involved. There is instead, once again here in terms of social distance, another sweet spot that appears of the interaction between the severity of the violation and its orientation toward that to which we are invested. We can enjoy a joke at our own expense, but perhaps generally more mild ones. More severe ones, they have to be removed. Study 4 of the McGraw 2012 work examined another aspect of distance, that being reality. They questioned that perhaps we are more likely to laugh at something when we understand that it isn't based in the real world. Why is it that South Park can seemingly get away with saying some absolute crazy shit that, in contrast, say an internet commentator such as myself would be castigated for saying or doing? Perhaps it's because South Park is a cartoon, and thereby anything that occurs within its context is perceived of as disparate and separated from reality. Well, again, and unsurprisingly, this appears to be affected by severity, with this picture of a man with a finger through his eye being perceived of as more funny when participants also thought it was fake. I mean, it's obviously fake. But with a picture of a man with icicles in his beard being perceived of as more funny when participants thought it was real and not in some way staged. Once again, here we come back to this Goldilocks zone, it seems, right? If it is realistic, the less severe, the more funny. But when it's fantastic, the more severe, the more funny. The more tragic, the more humorous it is. But only when we believe it to potentially be fantastic in nature. Interestingly, an almost identical result was forwarded when people saw the same images from a close physical distance or from a lengthy one, in that the finger through the eye image was more humorous when slightly physically obscured, and the iced beard image was more humorous when closer and more clear to the viewer. So we're starting to see a couple of fairly consistent themes here, right? To be funny, you have to exist in this very precise area of violation and simultaneous safety or benignity, what I have repeatedly called a Goldilocks zone. But we can look further and actually see this zone in action beyond just my description. McGraw, Williams, and Warren 2014, in a study I know I have cited before, because it, funnily enough, always makes me laugh by its very nature, attempted to isolate this zone in a semi-natural experiment by asking people to respond to the perceived humor of tweets made by a faux Hurricane Sandy account mocking the natural disaster as it happened, with messages such as, quote, "Just destroyed a Starbucks, now a pumpkin spice hurricane. Oh girl, no you ain't. You is a basic bitch hurricane for making that kind of joke. Sorry, can't help it." Anyway, the results illustrate this sweet spot we've been talking about, with tweets being perceived of as humorous before the hurricane hit the land, and then basically scraping the bottom of the amusement barrel during the days of its landfall. But interestingly, becoming almost equally as funny again as they were before the incident about 30 days later. Then, as time went on, the tweets ceased to be relevant and dipped into obscurity, and as such, in their perceived humor, on a steady decline after the cessation of the data collection after a 90-day period. Thus, not only do we have every reason to suspect that to make the funny, you need to be the right degree of offensive, the right degree of banal, and the right degree of social distance, and the right degree of physical distance, and the right degree of temporal distance. You have to manage all of that. But, most importantly, you want to be relevant. You want to be relevant in that you fall in the in-between of the too soon and old news categories.
Well, at least you can't blame this on the Jews.
Don't tempt me further.
It was an iceberg, not a Goldberg or a Silverberg.
Too soon.
Once again, Paul's not wrong in his initial assessment, at least in theory. He's just wrong in his application. If this series hasn't made it overwhelmingly clear, humor is a difficult concept to nail down. But here we can see data that illustrate when and why something is funny. But back to the basic topic at hand. Let's answer the question posed in our opening. Does that mean political correctness can't be funny? I mean, I know I answered it, but let's keep going. What we can glean from all of this should be fairly consistent at this point, and goes all the way back again to what Paul was rambling about. And that is that social context matters. Surprising that, isn't it? When political correctness is the norm, then no, PC jokes are generally not going to be funny to most people. Sure, we are again looking at averages and aggregates, and as such, it describes no one individual. Meaning surely someone will find PC safe jokes very amusing. I sure have. But the data indicate that in general, that which is too benign, that which is too in line with expectations, is probably not very funny. Further, there are all kinds of factors that affect perceptions of humors that can be generalized as proximity or distance from the joke, and severity of the joke, tragedy of the joke. In other words, why is politically correct humor generally not funny, Paul? Well, let's look again at the obvious whale-like pinata I like to keep wailing on in this series, Amy Schumer. She does not violate the expectations of how women are anticipated to behave in 2018, in the way that people like Joan Rivers, Ellen DeGeneres, Maria Bamford have in the past. She is not violating any expectations. There is no benign violation. As stand-up comedians, those people I just mentioned, Rivers, DeGeneres, Bamford, all of their work was novel, while Schumer's is derivative, sometimes in fact exact copies of other comics. She mostly comments on her sex life and herself, rather than controversial current topics that are actually taboo to society, that are temporally relevant, or even realistic enough to be humorous in the benign nature of her humor. It's too realistic. It's too normative. It is so tiresome. And that's why many modern comics are equally so tiresome alike. They are feeling castrated from being able to speak their minds, even when the messages themselves are fairly innocuous. And sorry for always bringing up my main mommies, Tom and Tina, but I've been listening to them for 6 years, so I can't help it. But here they are talking to Joe Rogan about the idea of gender fluidity, with a huge audience, knowing that people will be quick to judge. And if you listen, you can hear their hesitation to speak candidly.
My pronouns are not preferred.
See, and the thing is, like, I feel like there's enough people going, okay, really, that it's kind of a legitimate thing to not be 100% on board with this, you know? Because I feel a little like, oh, am I on the wrong end of history?
This is particularly evident in contrast to their coverage of the exact same topic in their own podcast, which despite being popular, still has a much smaller reach than the Joe Rogan Experience. And we can also find the same kind of freedom of expression of opinion through humor by Tom's appearances on a number of small local television channels.
Is it last year, you know, I came out as poly and bi, and now I'm proud to say that I'm non-binary.
What is that?
Oh, interesting.
Is there more to this? Because I'm confused.
Oh yeah, like, so most people fall within the male
Sure.
and female binary.
Yeah.
Right. And then I'm non-binary, so
Okay.
I don't fall into either one. You know, so like, I'm actually like fluid binary, meaning that depending on the moment, I kind of go between different genders.
Interesting.
So like today, I'm astral gender right now, which is I'm a gender from outer space.
So, in closing, can politically correct comedy be funny? Yes, of course. But you have to get to that Goldilocks zone. And it's going to be difficult when PC culture is the mainstream as it is currently. Even the media is hesitantly beginning to admit that constantly shitting on Trump is doing no favors to the left politically, and generally has created, even by the New York Times contributing writer and professor's own words, making liberals look like entitled, self-obsessed, egotistical, morality policing gits. Well, those weren't his words, those were mine, but hey, close enough to what the writer said, right? The fact is, Trump jokes aren't funny because they have been beaten to death within the mainstream. They are not novel. They are barely even relevant. They do nothing to elicit laughter in any of the various Goldilocks zones that I have covered above. Sure, you can be funny and politically correct, but it's going to be overwhelmingly difficult. All of the great left-leaning comedians of the past have disagreed with me politically, yes, but they were never politically correct, at least not according to today's standards. I guess there are some good examples of politically correct comedians, such as Bill Cosby, although, wouldn't touch that one anymore, literally or figuratively, who were mostly mundane, though, in their use of humor and achieved great mainstream success. But in my opinion, the truly greatest comics and comedic geniuses must always be those who are bombastic, gregarious, and ultimately those who violate us in a very special way, and not in the kind of way that Cosby did. While this video is actually quite similar to one I did last year on why the left can't meme, I wanted to go much more further in depth into benign violation theory, just what makes something funny from the standpoint of offensiveness, to further try and explain why it is that the left can't meme, despite the fact that so many of our beloved comedians are themselves leftists. That is, the leftist comedians who we have all enjoyed were violating the norms of their times. Even contemporary ones continue to, if they're funny, for the most part. Again, always exceptions. But if you want to see how this shit changes over time, consider the reception of Dave Chappelle's first and second Netflix specials as kind of a clear example of this. Most people remember Dave Chappelle's irreverent humor from his previous stand-up routines and, moreover, from his television program on Comedy Central. And then when he comes out in 2017, talking shit about Trump and politics in his new work like every other comic is, it's no real surprise that there is kind of a marked silence from the audience, almost like I've heard this one before.
That's it. Wow. Fuck you, motherfuckers. Fuck all of y'all. Fuck all of y'all. That's right. Fuck you. Yes. You. All of y'all. Take none of that shit.
And while, as I mentioned at the outset, we covered Derks and Cunningham 2005 and their analysis of how long-winded over-explication of jokes rips the humor out of them, there is more to be examined here in terms of personal differences between people who are attracted to being comics or attracted to being involved in the art of humor. So stick around for the next installment of this series as we dissect the frog that is the psychology of comedy. And in short, the answer to the question, once again, you can be PC and funny, but PC does not lend itself well to humor, not in the current year. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.
Pretty good. Pretty